That's why I came. That's why I agreed. I thought we were having a salmon barbecue right in the middle there. Oh, well, maybe. Just a short prayer and we'll get this event going. You may remain seated. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together. Just guide each and every one of us in the path that we are taking. And thanking the communities from which we come from for allowing us to do the work that we do, and also our families for the time that we miss with them. I ask Great Spirit to bless each and every one of you as leaders and mentors of those who follow you, those who witness what you do and what you say. And a very special blessing on our families who are not being able to be with us and the people not being able to be with us. And just have a great big blessing on the people here, on my relations.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was absolutely a lovely, perfect way to start this. Let me just introduce you sort of to our run of show. I'm going to just be giving very, very brief welcoming remarks, no worries. And then I will be turning you over to our keynote speakers for this evening, which will be Brent and Courtney. And then we'll be having a panel discussion for about 30 to 40 minutes with our panelists, and I will be introducing them as we go along with the event, followed by a 20-minute question and answer, well, a dialogue, because of the room that we're in, right, with you, our audience. And so our moderator will be educating everyone about how to use your microphones, but it's pretty straightforward. You press the button, it works. You stop pressing the button, it doesn't. But we'll have a little bit of time to get everybody up to speed with that. And then we'll have our call to action followed by a lovely reception out front. So again, thank you very much for being here. Before we get started, I would love to acknowledge the support that we've had for this event. First off, SFU Department of Psychology, who agreed to be the primary sponsor for this event, and our esteemed chair, Dr. Deb Connolly, who when we brought this to her attention a few months ago, that we wanted to do a colloquium on the psychology of climate change, said, you know what, it's too important an issue, why not? Pretty much tell me what you need and let's make this happen. So thank you very much for that, Deb. We really appreciate that. Also, the generous support of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at SFU and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. We also want to acknowledge the assistance of the Resource and Environment Management faculty at SFU and the Faculty of the Environment. I am really excited to welcome you guys here today to discuss the role that we can play in transforming the global food systems. And I'm also thrilled to be able to introduce such an incredible multidisciplinary team that's literally flown here from around the world to be here to discuss these issues with us today. Food production, and I did not know this until recently, but food production is the single largest cause of environmental change. And there's increasing realization that dietary changes are absolutely necessary, not only to meet our climate obligations, but also for our health. Many people have been asking me in the past couple of weeks, why psychology? Why the psychology of change? What does psychology have to bring to the table? And my answer to that is, well, have you ever tried to make a change? Have you ever tried to change your behavior, to be a little healthier, to eat a little better, to exercise a little more? Maybe to be a more attentive parent, or to improve your coping strategies, or to improve your relationships. If anybody's ever tried to make a change like that, you know one thing, and that change is hard. Psychology is a discipline that is really focused on understanding how people think, how people feel, and how people behave, and finally, how people change. So what we can bring to the table here is an understanding of some of those barriers to change, and also some techniques to help mobilize effective responses and adaptations to change. But what's very clear putting on an event like this is no discipline can do this alone. This has got to be a multidisciplinary effort. And so I am absolutely thrilled that we have the speakers and the panelists that we have here this evening to represent the complexity of this issue and engage in a dialogue in this issue. And I really have faith that we can leave here tonight feeling energized, feeling mobilized, and feeling like we have something tangible that we can bring forward to help facilitate this change. So, without further ado, I now have the great privilege of introducing our keynote speakers. Dr. Courtney Howard is the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and was the 2018 International Policy Coordinator for the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. She also happens to be an SFU alumni. Dr. Howard spent 6 months resuscitating malnourished children at a Doctors Without Borders project in a slum in Djibouti, prior to beginning work as an ER doc serving a majority Indigenous population in Yellowknife in the Canadian Arctic. Dr. Brent Loken will be speaking subsequently. Dr. Brent Loken, just met the guy. Here he's a bit of a sketchy character. He is the Director of Science Translation at EAT and was a lead author on the EAT Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems. He's an SFU alumnus and has published numerous articles on health and sustainability. His current work focuses on turning research into action and collaborating with business and policymakers to develop science-based targets for the food system. And he also happens to be my brother. Okay, so we're going to start then this event. Dr. Courtney Howard will illustrate the scope of the problem of our rising climate temperatures with a special emphasis on the impact on health. And then Brent will present a solution by highlighting the findings of the EAT Lancet report, which presents scientific targets for a healthy and sustainable diet.
Thank you. I've been told that this will magically turn on. It's going to magically turn on. Has anyone got their wand? Is yours working first?
Mine is, is mine working? You want mine?
Yes, please. Now we get to do like a quick change in front of humans, which is fun. I was a dance grad at SFU as well as being a science grad, so it's not my first quick change at an SFU event.
While they're getting situated, I should make an announcement, though. This event is being filmed and simulcast, and so this part of the stage, you can pretty much presume if you're sitting up here, there's a good chance that you might be on camera. If you're not comfortable with that, I would strongly encourage you to sort of move away from this piece of the pie, okay, into the corners.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I talking loud enough? Yeah, right on. Okay, I have to say this is a lot swanker than any part of SFU that I ever went to as a student was. So congratulations, good job SFU. Clearly things are going well here. So I'm really excited to speak here. I've spent at least 10 years now motivating doctors around climate change, and I really thought that the very first time I ever told them the facts, they were going to be like, okay, let's go do it. And they didn't. And I think the reason they didn't is because of psychology. So really, at this point, we know that there's a whole set of evidence around the health impacts of climate change, and then there's a whole other set of evidence that has to do with psychology that lets us know how best to communicate that evidence to audiences. And so please know that everything you hear today is incredibly important for helping us achieve the action we want. So this is a photo that I took on a little plane between Inuvik and Klavik in the Northwest Territories. This part of the world is already 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the 1950s, just according to the temperature gauge at the airport. Now, this is a majority Indigenous territory, and these ice places are actually roads for people in the wintertime. So this is the Mackenzie River. It's known as the Amazon of the North. And this is how people transport building supplies. It's a road to help them go hunt caribou, to fish. And since 3 degrees Celsius has changed things so much, unfortunately, the ice roads are less stable. People are much more likely to go through the ice. And we're seeing major changes already to the nutritional status of the Indigenous people who live here, because the lean protein from the land is still the cheapest and healthiest thing for them to eat. The rapidly changing landscape just looks different too. This is a flat sort of terrain in this photo, but on a hill, if permafrost at the bottom of a hill melts, it actually creates a landslide. I live on permafrost. I don't know that I would buy another house on permafrost. Sort of trying to slide down into Great Slave Lake. So the structural issues are actually huge too, and the rapidly changing landscape. You can imagine if you grew up somewhere and it looked one way, and then all of a sudden there's mudslides, what they call them, all over the place. It's upsetting. And so there's a word for that. It's called solastalgia. It's feeling homesick when you're still at home. And a lot of the first research on eco-anxiety and ecological grief was actually done in the high Arctic by Ashley Consulo, working with Inuit populations. So that's some of how climate change is impacting health where I live. But how is it impacting health where you live? So this slide is drawn from a 2012 British Medical Journal article by Michael et al. It has a little bit of Watt's 2015 and 17 in there too. So climate change is going to create immediate and direct risks for health, indirect risks, and risks associated with conflict and environmental refugee flows. So in the immediate and direct risks sort of category, this is what we see on the news every day. So heat waves create heat stress, heat stroke, death from dehydration. Droughts can lead to decreased water supply, which can lead to migration and conflict, and also make wildfires more likely. Like, I'm a BCer, I vacation in the Okanagan every year, and my 5-year-old has experienced severe wildfires now for 4 out of the 5 years of her life. And I know that that really impacted life here in the Lower Mainland. Your air quality health index for several days last summer was 10, topping out at 10. And we know that air pollution results in basically increased cough, respiratory disease. Over long term, it can increase risks of lung cancer. It's really significant. And we actually, as a result of a really severe wildfire season in Yellowknife, did what turned out to be the world's first study into how it actually feels to live through a really prolonged smoke event. Does it feel good? No, it really doesn't. And so people felt sad, they felt isolated, they felt lonely. They got a lot less exercise because they were stuck inside. And the whole experience made them aware. It was a sentinel event for them that made them more aware of climate change as sort of a really concrete process that had the power to impact them and their kids. So the concept of ecological grief is really starting to increasingly enter the conversation. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so glad we're here talking about this, because when you think about things that make you feel sad, do you tend to want to go towards them and think about them a lot and then solve that problem? Not so much, right? You're like, oh, I'm gonna go over here, I'm gonna go do this chocolate now, right? And so the opportunity we have here today is to sit with those feelings a little bit and discuss things and try to find some solutions. So further things, storms in terms of extreme weather can lead to floods, can pollute, bring basically dirty water into clean water supplies. It can also take out critical healthcare infrastructure. So hospitals can get flooded. Hurricane Maria actually took out the world's biggest normal saline manufacturer. And what that did was it created normal saline shortages as far north as where I live. So, our integrated supply chain means that all of this, a severe storm on the other side of the world does have the potential to impact health where we live. Increasing temperatures make for longer and more severe pollen seasons. This leads to respiratory problems, allergies. We've got major changes in infectious disease. So Lyme disease is marching across Canada in the Lancet Countdown this year. They really track big changes in dengue fever, malaria distributions are changing. So all of this is kind of at play. Now, all of this, as we know, is being driven partly by increasing levels of CO2, largely as a result of changes in burning fossil fuels. And something that we're well positioned to understand as scientists is that CO2 in air will equilibrate or kind of seep into water bodies underneath. And in water bodies, it actually acts as an acid. And so that's bad news for the fish. And it's bad news for the approximately 1 billion people worldwide who rely on fish as their main source of protein. Now, all of this weird weather does bad things to food crops, and malnutrition is already, right now, responsible for almost 50% of pediatric deaths worldwide. So we're in a place, and that doesn't have to do all with sort of food production. There's maldistribution, there's political reasons for why different populations don't get food, but it's certainly something we need to take into account. Now, this was all brought home to me in a huge way when I spent 6 months resuscitating malnourished children in Djibouti. Now, as a trainee in a dock in Canada, I only had one child die under my care before going to Djibouti. And that is simply not the case when you're working with severely malnourished infants. I had many children die under my care, and it's definitely the knowledge that malnutrition is forecast to be the main health impact of climate change in the 21st century in the face of this experience that keeps people working on this as hard as I do. Now, all of this, you can imagine if you're a kid, I'm going to take advantage of our circular structure and go like this over to the other side. And so basically, if your kid didn't have food, you do almost anything. I'm a mom. I would do anything to get my kid food. So you may go to a different place. You may move to where someone else's home is, and they might not like it that you came. So there's already some academic literature, some studies showing climate-related drought and basically famine implicated in different conflicts. And certainly, as part of my Lancet Countdown job this last year, I did a brief with Doctors Without Borders. So spent a couple of months talking to some of the world's top humanitarians about their concerns and putting it into a policy brief, which you could find. And this is what they're worried about. They're worried about resource scarcity leading to population displacement, conflict, war. And so our task right now is to keep warming to a level that we can cope with. So we think we can cope with 1.5 degrees Celsius of worldwide surface temperature warming. We hope we can cope with 2 degrees Celsius. Right now we're heading to about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. Now that means that a child born today could experience that. So these little people that we love so much, whose teeth we're brushing, could be exposed to this level of warming, and we don't think we can adapt to that. And when I say that, it means it will be difficult for us to maintain a level of civilizational organization that could allow us to have things like healthcare structures. So what are the main fixes for this? Well, I like to talk about the things that improve health and also decrease carbon dioxide emissions at the same time. So worldwide, the major thing we need to do is make sure that women and girls have access to education and family planning. And that includes making sure that people have access to family planning here in Canada, because there are discrepancies. The other major things we can do right now that decrease the things that Canadians are already dying of in terms of chronic disease are cleaning up our energy supply so that we decrease air pollution. That lets us do less extraction of fossil fuels, which will help keep our water clean. And also moving to more active transport. There's way more cycling by routes downtown than there used to be. That's great because cycling actually decreases mortality. And air pollution. I mean, there's no pill I could give to all of you that could decrease your mortality. That's amazing. Now, one of the other main ones, and the opportunity we're here to talk about today, is moving towards a more plant-based diet. So I think we have to just be so excited. For a long time, we didn't really know exactly sort of what the numbers were and exactly what we ought to tell patients around this. There was stuff you could find, but you had to look for it. Luckily, a giant team of international scientists spent a bunch of time taking a look at what the specifics of that are, and here's Brent to tell us what we ought to be aiming for.
Super.
Yeah.
Thank you, Courtney, very much. Thank you. That was great. It is a huge, massive honor to be here, and even cooler to be introduced by your sister. I never thought when I got my PhD that we were going to be able to come back to SFU and do this, but what an honor. And what an honor to be joined by all of you guys to talk about something which we all love, food. I mean, who doesn't love to eat? I mean, and that's one of the joys about food. I mean, you see this room where it's filled up. We've had outstanding, tremendous response to this report, almost 7,000 articles globally. We've got kids in Africa that are changing diets to try and implement the planetary health diet. We've got chefs that are trying to implement this. We've got people talking about this. We've got industry coming after us. We've got people talking about this because it's such a passionate issue. Everybody has an opinion about food. And that's what's so cool about it. But up until this point, we haven't had clear guidance on where we need to go and how we're going to get there. A lot of disagreement. So what we've done with this report, a bit like the IPCC, is how do we build scientific consensus around what defines healthy and sustainable diets? And that's what we're going to walk through today. We'll have a panel discussion about some of these issues, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards, and I'm assuming there will be lots of questions. So I'll give a very high-level overview of the report. But I'm not going to talk about the problems. I think we know what the problems are. Courtney set up the problems very, very nicely. There are a lot of issues. People are getting less healthy. Food is the main culprit of health issues and environmental issues. Food is a problem. It's also a source of opportunity. So what our goal was, we set out 3 years ago. We thought it was going to take 12 months, then 18. 3 years later, we finally were able to produce this report. It was a massive undertaking of what we did. The main goal that we set out to do is we were trying to figure out, is it possible to feed 10 billion people by 2050 a healthy and sustainable diet. Not just a healthy diet, not just a quantity, not just calories, but a healthy and sustainable diet. Is it possible? That was our goal. So what was the approach that we took? First was we had to define what a healthy diet was. And I would say this is an extremely difficult thing to do. If I was to go around and ask you guys, what is a healthy diet? You'd probably get extremely different answers from so many people. And this is what the problem is. Is it a keto diet? Is it a paleo diet? Is it high carbs, low carbs, fish, no fish, meat, sugar? There's so many issues out there that people want to understand. We said we've got to scour all the evidence out there and come to a consensus about what defines a healthy diet just for us. Now, when we defined the healthy diet, we just looked at what optimizes health for us. We did not consider the environment. So we put a firewall between them. We said, what do we need? Then we said, what can the earth tolerate? When we produce this food, how much greenhouse gas emissions can we put out there? Water can we use? Biodiversity can we lose? What's the total impact that we can have when we produce food? Right now, the impact is massive. If we're going to produce it for 10 billion people, how much can we have? Then we modeled it and we said, is it actually possible to feed that healthy diet to every single person on this planet? And then we outlined some 5 high-level strategies about how we're going to do it. So let's talk about the first target, which is what is a healthy diet. So what we did, we broke it down by major food groups: whole grains, tubers, starchy vegetables, fruits, dairy foods, protein sources, added fats, added sugars. I think when you look at the whole grains, vegetables, and fruits, they're in line with a lot of national, international recommendations out there. You should be eating lots of fruits and vegetables. What we set is we set an individual number, which is the amount of grams per day that you need. So if you look at vegetables, it's 300 grams per day. Fruits, 200 grams per day. But we also included a range, because there's so much uncertainty when we're talking about diets. And a lot of it is quite large. So when we look at vegetables, it's anywhere between 200 to 600 grams per day seems to be the range to optimize our diet. Fruits, 100 to 300. Not much debate there. It's the protein sources where the debate seems to be coming from. How much dairy should we have each day? The evidence is indicating that it's about 250 grams per day, a single serving of dairy, whole milk per day. Now, Canada's consuming a lot more than that. I live in Sweden. It's a lot more than 250 grams per day. Protein sources: red meats, beef, lamb, pork. 14 grams per day, which is about 100 grams per week. That's about a single hamburger per week. A single serving of red meat is, from a health perspective, is the level that we should be eating to optimize our health. Anything above that increases our risk for cardiovascular disease and certain types of cancers. Chicken and other poultry, 29 grams, about a serving and a half per week. Eggs, 13 grams per day, which is 1.5 eggs per week. Not very many. The major emphasis has to be here is on nuts and legumes, a shift away from the animal source proteins to the plant source proteins. 50 grams of nuts per day, 75 grams of legumes. That's a major shift, and I would say most of us in here might not be eating that. And also a shift away from the saturated oils to the unsaturated oils when we're looking at fats. Now, what does that look like? It's hard to conceptualize numbers like this. Essentially, if we're to have a plate of food, it's about half your plate should be fruits and vegetables. Almost a quarter of it whole grains, and not processed grains, but whole grains. Very little dairy and red meats, and a focus on the plant source proteins and nuts. That's where the emphasis has to be. Now, you might look at this and you might say, geez, it's really restrictive. A single hamburger per week, what can we do with this? Where can we eat it? But actually, it's extremely flexible. When you look at the types of cuisines that you can eat from this diet, It ranges in terms of many different types of foods. Now, it's also not a new diet. People have been eating this way for millennia. Look at like the Mediterranean diet. This is a Mediterranean diet. You know, we're not putting something radical up here that you should be looking at it going, wow, that's really new, and you know, it's actually not. The Okinawan diet, the Indian diet, there's many people in the world that are already eating this way. It's the West where we've had a major shift in the foods that we eat over the last couple of generations. Sugars, processed foods, fatty foods, saturated fats. That's what's causing the problem today. What we're saying is we need to take the red meats, take the animal source foods and put them off to the side. They have to become a complement and not the center. Now, I like lobster, but I'm not going to eat lobster every single day. Lobster is a treat. I have it every once in a while. It's the same with red meat. We have to shift our thinking and say red meat is a treat. We have to put it off to the side, and we can have it once in a while, but not every meal. Now, where are we today? We're eating way too much of the bad stuff. So if you look at the orange dotted line here, that is the limit that we should be eating to. So above that is too much, under that orange is not enough. This is in North America. We're 638% above when you're looking at red meats. Way too much tubers, starchy vegetables, too many eggs, way too much dairy. Too much of the bad stuff and not enough of the good stuff. Now contrast that with what's going on in South Asia. Not enough of almost everything. So I think what this highlights is in certain parts of the world, the US, Canada, Europe, we're eating too much stuff. We're eating too many calories, too much of the wrong stuff at the expense of so many people on this planet. And if we believe in the Sustainable Development Goals and we believe that food is a right and every single person has a right to this, then in some parts of the world we have to decrease consumption of some foods so that others can increase their consumption. It's a contract and converge type of policy thinking. Now, we just got this Canadian data. So what's going on in Canada? And it's hot off the press, and I apologize because you can't really see it. But do you see those lines, those blue lines that go way out there? Well, what do you think that is? Beef, lamb, pork. So even worse than it looks like what's happening in the US. So it looks like Canadians really like your red meats. So in Canada, there has to be a huge shift away from animal source foods. What about the health benefits? We use 3 different modeling techniques to look at this. We will save approximately 11 million lives per year by switching to this diet. 11 million lives per year. In Canada, hot off the press, we're looking at nearly 70,000 lives per year. The most of that comes from the very first, which is decreasing obesity rates. Decrease that risk factor, it has a huge impact on health. Almost 70,000 lives saved per year. So, that's the health. Let's talk about the environment. So what we also did is we set planetary boundaries for 6 different targets. And these are a bit harder to look at and understand. But we said, how much greenhouse gas emissions can you put out there? Land can you change? Fresh water can you use? What we're saying is we have to stay within these hard targets. These are the limits to what we can put out there when we are producing food. And we modeled it and we said, well, can we feed that healthy diet to everybody? So we looked at 3 different actions. First was a shift to the healthy diet. That was the first action. The second is having food loss and waste globally. The third is improving the way that we produce food. One was a moderate level of ambition, and the last was a very high level of, like it's like on steroids, okay? So we looked at those 3 different techniques, and this is what happens. Can we produce food for every single person on the planet within the boundaries that we're setting, within the limits that the Earth places upon us? Now that 100% dashed line, that's the environmental limits that the Earth places upon us. We should not be above this line. Above it is bad, within it is where we need to head. What this is saying is that by 2050, if we don't do anything, we continue to eat the way that we're doing, produce the way that we're doing, waste the way that we're doing, we're going to be 96% above where we have to be by 2050. It's way over that line. Now, how do we get within it? How do we bring it down? Dietary shifts get us there. The only thing we have to do is shift our diets if we are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in terms of agency, so many, I used to work in Borneo, saving rainforest and working with orangutans, and people used to always ask me, what can I do? And it's really hard to come up with an answer for some of this kind of stuff. But the thing about food and shifting diets, if there's one thing you can do if you care about the planet, if you care about health, change what you eat, period. So greenhouse gas emissions gets us all the way there. What does changing production practices do? Well, it only decreases the greenhouse gas emissions by between 18 to 22%. What happens about having waste? Only decreases it by 12%. So if we focus on only something like having waste, and a lot of people are saying, well, we've got to reduce food loss and waste, and that's all good, but it only decreases emissions by 12% if we don't shift diets also. Now, this last wedge is doing everything together. Combining all three, that's where we have the most impact. This is where we need to be heading, is combine every single action, and we get way within the planetary boundary. If we look at all the other environmental limits, cropland use, water use, N application, phosphorus application, and also biodiversity loss, you'll see that the various actions have different amounts of impact depending on which one of the environmental area you're looking at. This looks a bit colorful and maybe a bit confusing, but let's just look at what happens with the combined impact. It gets us in with the uncertainty zone or within our boundary for every single environmental limit. In a nutshell, what this says is we can do it. We can feed 10 billion people on this planet a healthy and sustainable diet and do it without messing up the planet. That is an extremely powerful message. That's an extremely hopeful message. We can get there. How do we get there? What are the 5 strategies? Very high level. First one, obviously, is we have to get governments to shift their diets. We have to seek national and international commitment for a global shift towards diet. In some areas, they're already there. In some areas, it's saying, don't shift your diet, just don't adopt our diet. Okay? Just hold on to what you're doing. In other areas, it's saying, yeah, we need that radical shift. But we need commitments from governments, from policymakers, from business. Everybody has to get on board to do this. It can't just be the individual, it has to be everybody. Second, we have to reorient priorities from producing just quantities of food. It can't just be about calories. It has to also be about calories and healthy food, both of them together. In the past, we've just focused on calories, saying it's just, can we produce enough? That's not good enough anymore. Now, if we look at where we have to change food, well, whole grains. This is where all the emphasis has been on producing different type rice and corn and different types of grains. We don't need to increase those anymore. We're producing enough already. Where we have to increase production, vegetables increased by 75%, fruits by more than 50%, fish by more than 50%, legumes 75%, nuts 150% globally. These are all global numbers. Red meats, a decrease by 65%. So there has to be a shift away from the red meats and the animal source foods towards the fish, the nuts, the legumes. Strategy 3, intensify production everywhere. We have no more land that we can convert to farmland. We have maxed it out. So what we need to do is figure out how we do it on the land that we have. Here, green is we're doing pretty good, and blue means that we're doing pretty good. So in Canada, US, Europe, we're doing pretty good from an agricultural standpoint. But look at Africa, very, very poorly. We need to figure out how to more sustainably do a better job in the areas where we're already where we have high yields? In areas where we have poor yields, how do we intensify them? I mean, the yields in Africa are extremely low. One way is to get fertilizers, N&P, into these areas. A global redistribution of N&P everywhere will get us there. But that's going to take coordination by all of us. Had to put a picture of an orangutan in there because I used to work with them. So this last one, this might be, or this fourth one, this might be one of the hardest ones. How do we have strong and coordinated governance of the land and the oceans? And the thing about it is it's not just countries focusing on how they do this themselves, it's everybody has to do this together. It's not just about local food. It's about global food. It's about figuring out where we're going to produce the food, optimizing land use globally, figuring out how we work together, and doing it. The problem is that's not where we're heading globally today. The world is heading in the opposite direction. We need to figure out how to use food as a lever to reverse that trend. And lastly, we need to at least have food losses and waste. Now, Canadian context, I'm going to pass it back to Courtney, and we're going to talk about some of the great things that Canada's already doing.
I think and my mic is magically on. Good job, magic mic human. So Canadian context. So like many of you, I spend a lot of time trying to ask people to do things and trying to make things happen. And it can be really hard. It can take a really long time. And we are incredibly lucky right now in Canada because we just had this amazing new commission come out, and we could have spent like 25 years trying to get something consistent with that into policy. But it's already happened. About 10 days after the Eat Lancet Commission came out, Health Canada announced our new food guide. And according to everybody at Health Canada and at the Lancet Commission, there is tremendous parallel between these two plans. So basically, we already have, we've just been given the gift by our Health Canada colleagues of a guide that is a tool that we can use to take our population to this place that we need to go. And I just, how did this happen? Like just in terms of getting policy created, how did that happen? It's really important to just know that this was possible because the Minister of Health at the time gave permission to her department to do this process without closed-door meetings with industry. That is someone I am proud to call another physician in Canada. It's Dr. Jane Philpott. So you can talk to whoever you want to at Health Canada about, to a person, they say that we would not have this evidence-based guide without Jane Philpott having that courage. And led by her, they all got their elbows up. They all stood up to pressure from various cabinet members around the table, and they got this through. So if you happen to see someone from Health Canada in the next little while, just say thank you, because they were tremendously courageous in getting this in. And so now our job is to match their courage, to match their know-how, to stand up and create the change we need to do. And so we're here with incredibly smart people on our panel to help us figure out how to do that in our local and national contexts. And Wendy's going to introduce the panel.
Oh, thank you. All right, so and again, just a little reminder, if you're paying attention to the hashtags and to the Twitter handles for all of the speakers today, if you'd like to keep the dialogue going with any of the people that you hear today. So our moderator, Dr. Evan Fraser, very pleased. He's a director of the Arel Food Institute at the University of Guelph. So thank you for flying all the way out here today. He's the author of over 100 scientific papers and chapters and has written 2 popular nonfiction books about food and food security, including Empires of Food, Feast, Famine, and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations. Currently, he holds the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and is a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. So thank you very much, Evan, for being our moderator today. And then I also want to introduce our panelists. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of waving or standing up a little bit or just letting people know who you are here. So Dr. Susan Clayton. All right, is a Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio. She has written or edited several books, including most recently Psychology and Climate Change, published in 2018. Her PhD from Yale University is in social psychology. Her research focuses on the human relationships with nature, how it is socially constructed, how it can be utilized to promote environmental concern. She's written extensively about the implications of climate change for human well-being. Dr. Hannah Whitman, all right, is the academic director of the Center for Sustainable Food Systems and professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC. Trained in rural and environmental sociology, she conducts community-based research and outreach related to food sovereignty, agroecology, agrarian citizenship in Canada and Latin America. Dr. Clifford Atleo from SFU. He is a Nuu-chah-nulth and Tsimshian scholar, researching and teaching Indigenous governance, resource management, and political economy at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU. He's particularly interested in Indigenous community resilience, change, and continuity with respect to political and economic practices. Dr. Tamara Soma is assistant professor with the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU as well, co-founder and research director of Food Systems Labs, a self-professed food system planner, and co-founder of the International Food Loss and Food Waste Studies Group, an international network of food waste scholars, activists, and influencers. And Ned Bell. Hi, Ned. What, sorry? But you look exactly like a chef. You know, I think I have you pegged. Ned Bell is a chef. Who knew? Father, advocate, and educator. Ned serves as the executive chef of Oceanwise and is the founder of Chefs for Oceans, culinary director of the Vancouver Club, and global champion at the 2017 Seafood Summit. So as you can see, we have quite a remarkably diverse panel from many different locales. And now, Evan,
thanks.
Take it away.
Thanks, everybody. Well, this is great fun. And Brent, it's especially a pleasure. Brent reached out to me about 18 months ago or so, and we've been brainstorming and dreaming about convening a conversation like this one ever since then. And hey, to kick things off, I'd like you all, panelists included, panelists especially, to imagine that we're 100 years from now. It's 2119, and maybe our kids or our grandkids or our great-grandkids pull a book off the shelf on the history of this time. And I'm going to say that as they run their thumb down that table of contents in this virtual library of the future, I'm going to say that, that there's a list of big issues. Climate change, of course, political extremism, migration, and of course there will be a robust, but maybe not meaty, chapter on food. Oh, come on. So, but then I think let's then imagine that this chapter on food is an optimistic chapter, that there's more good news than bad news in it. Because I'm not actually pessimistic by this. I think that, that this chapter on food will have a lot of debates and a lot of disagreements, and it will be about rural communities struggling to adapt to new technologies and new consumer demands. It will be about how the consumers, us, learn to pay the full cost of our food, the full environmental and full social cost, while society as a whole grapples with trying to make sure that the poor and the marginal don't bear the price of expensive food. I think these are the debates that will be in there, but I think it's going to be a chapter with more optimistic than pessimistic things. And I would now like to turn to the panelists to start thinking about how we can chart a way forward, how we can debate these serious, important issues that, the Commission has laid before us, but also how we can do it. So Hannah, I think I've known you the longest of everybody on the panel, and I'd like to just start with you. And we've got a couple of questions, and one of the issues that I'm concerned about with the Eat Lancet reference diet that we just heard about has to do with labor. Because let's face it, fruits and vegetables, they take a lot of labor to produce. And amongst the most exploited people in society are our agricultural laborers. So, Hannah, I would like to open the floor with you and say, how do you reflect on the labor implications of some of the stuff we've just heard about, and how can we make sure that this labor requirements are done in a dignified way?
Great. Thanks, Evan, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. You know, as we labor in our work and in our preparing of our food, I think it is really important to think about the hands that are actually cultivating and gathering and harvesting the food that we eat every day. And sometimes, and increasingly so, these hands are mechanical because of some of the labor challenges that we face. The commodity grains that are such a dominant part of our food system are super mechanized, require large amounts of capital investment, and are really based on a production model that has proved to be very environmentally unsustainable in many cases. So it's really exciting to think about, well, if we want to increase our vegetables 75%, our fruit 50%, our nuts 150%, how can we do that with decent, dignified labor conditions? And so one of the inspiring, I think, if we're looking at optimist, we have a lot of people actually paying attention to labor rights now. We have justice for migrant workers here in Canada. We have people really challenging programs like the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, which exploit, in many cases, people from marginalized communities who may have been displaced from their own agricultural systems by commodity agriculture. And we have people coming together to talk about things like food justice in our restaurant system, food justice in our food providing system. And there's a lot of parallels being drawn on how we can change diets, but then also get more people involved in the food system in dignified ways. So, for example, a lot of youth are interested in farming. So how can we as consumers support these new farming enterprises by participating in CSAs, by participating in farmers markets, by participating in kind of local food economies? How do we change our diets such that we're developing labeling systems for fair labor, just like we have for fair trade or for organic? So I think some of these initiatives are very much on the table. Sorry. But I think that there's a lot of potential to really look at the jobs development and the economic possibilities of increasing very labor-intensive fruit and veg while being careful about the potential to make sure those are not degrading employment conditions.
Hey, thanks for that, Hannah. Tamara, I'm going to jump to the other end of the row right now. And one of the things that Hannah was just talking about really linked consumers and laborers and choice in together. And one of the things that I've always admired of your work is that you take a bit of a systems lens to food systems. So I'd like to maybe go from the field that Hannah was just talking about and jump out to the systems level, and maybe you can reflect on how a systems approach to understanding food can help us plot that pathway forward.
That's perfect. That's a perfect question. And as Wendy mentioned in my introduction, I'm a self-professed food system planner. And for those of you in the room who might not be familiar with food system planning, it's basically the integration of food system consideration into urban planning, spatial land use, policy, decision making. And so I think what's really great about this field is that there are two key contributions, I would say. The first one is improving physical accessibility. So if we want to have this good food transformation, we need to think about physical access, space, right? Another thing is economic accessibility, making sure that the fresh fruits and vegetables that we want people to consume are actually people can actually afford it, in a nutshell. And so from a municipal planning perspective, I want to bring in the case of Belo Horizonte, because I think it's really great and empowering to hear, experiences and best practice from the Global South. In Belo Horizonte, the municipal government basically committed to food as a right. And by doing that, they ensured that any citizen living in Belo Horizonte is able to access fresh, healthy food. And by creating that access for farmers to relate directly to consumers, making sure that farmers had strategic spaces, improving access to community garden and urban agriculture program, that really changed the way that cities are built. Now, from an economic standpoint, the municipality actually invested only 2% of the budget just on food alone. And through doing that, they were able to halve undernourishment by 50%. So if our cities are, really interested in truly changing and transforming towards a good food, healthy diet, as well as a sustainable food system, we need more commitment on physical and economic access.
So that's so interesting. Because you're talking about social and economic marginalization. I'd like to pick up keep with that theme for a sec. And Cliff, I'm gonna jump you into the conversation here. And when the Eat Lancet report came out about 6 weeks ago, I called up a woman who I'd like to call a friend who I esteem very highly, Sheila Watt-Kluche, an Inuit circumpolar leader. And I asked her what she thought about it, and she was less than thrilled. She comes from a community that eats a lot of seal and caribou, And she sort of used words like eco-colonial, and is this just another tool by which Southerners are going to further marginalize Indigenous communities? So I would like to give you, Cliff, the opportunity to say, to answer the question, how do we reconcile the Eat Lancet or the Canadian Food Guide with an Indigenous perspective that might be based on game and land meat much more specifically?
Yeah, thank you. I think eco-colonial definitely is a real thing. It's a real possibility. I think my perspective on this report and this commission is that I think it's a good approach to think about globally. I think it's an important thing to start conversations. But I imagine in terms of its implementation, there would be tremendous diversity that was location-based. And so, yeah, if you think about my dad's Nuu-chah-nulth, my mom is Tsimshian from the West Coast, there's a tremendous amount of seafood in our diets, traditionally speaking. And then where Sheila's from, of course, in the north, even more so in that regard. So I think it would be problematic if something like this were to go forward, in these conversations about national discussions about changing diets, is like, it's got to be like this for every single person in this country. But I think if you're thinking about it in terms of averages and sort of overall global impact, I think there should be some room for that local diversity, which I think is still very important.
Awesome. Okay, so you introduced us to seafood a second ago, so I think I was trying to decide whether to pitch to Susan or Ned next, but Ned, your finger's on the buzzer. Aquaculture, seafood, producing more protein from our marine resources without completely degrading our wild resources, and the balance between wild and aquaculture or farmed. Where do you stand on this, and where does your organization stand on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously honored here to be here today, and thrilled to talk about my focus for healthy oceans. I, rode my bike across Canada in the summer of 2014 to start a foundation called Chefs for Oceans. Really. Now
you're just bragging.
Well, I'm not a doctor, so I have to. I'm the only person. I'm the only person up there with not the DR in front of them. So I'm obviously
fair enough.
Honored to be here. I'm a cyclist, so proud to focus on health and wellness. But really the goal of Chefs for Oceans was to engage my peers across this country through the people that we feed's bellies. If I make something tasty and put it in your belly, you're going to like me, and if you like me, you're going to listen to my message. What we had two BHAGs with Chefs for Oceans was really, one was to create a National Sustainable Seafood Day, a day that really focused on the three oceans, lakes and rivers that are so incredibly important to our food systems here in this country, not only for the couple hundred years that Canadians have been here, but for the 12,000 years of First Nations peoples that have long been conscious consumers and stewards of our ecosystem. As the exec chef of OceanWise, obviously our goal is to educate my peer group and then have my peer group educate the people that we feed around what does sustainable seafood mean. Whether it's wild, well-managed fisheries, whether it's Canadian fisheries, small scale or medium, maybe even some large ones, although we don't have many large ones left that are quote-unquote sustainable. 50% of the seafood we consumed globally last year was farmed. 80% of the seafood we consume in Canada is imported. So, you may have a sort of a stance on what fish farming looks like. I call it responsible aquaculture. That could be the cultivation of shellfish, Mother Nature's real fast food. All it has to do is drink a healthy ocean. So, first of all, we should be eating more oysters for multiple reasons. Mussels, clams, shellfish. Mariculture, where you're growing multiple species in the same ecosystem, so seaweeds that create environments for rockfish. Finfish aquaculture, which is a fish that swims, and whether that's done in the ocean or on land, and whether that's salmon or other species that we can grow in the ocean or on land. So, I really look at aquaculture, clean, healthy protein. Obviously wild fish. Wild fish, my goal is to protect wild seafood so that we can continue to eat it. We have to remember that, Mother Nature still gives us wild fish. It's not our right to eat it all. And so as we continue to look ahead to 9 billion, 10 billion people, and we're going to eat a billion of us eat from the oceans every day for our main source of protein. You know, how are we going to continue to be able to eat more seafood? You know, I put out a book last year called Lure. I want to lure people into the conversation of sustainable seafood because I want us to eat more fish, more compositions of vegetables, you know, with sustainable seafood as the garnish, not as the center of the plate, but as the garnish. Instead of 8 ounces, it's 3. So that we can bring value to the fishermen and the communities and the species and the ecosystem, but also really look at, as you mentioned earlier, meat as a treat. You know, let's look at wild protein from the ocean as an incredible gift that Mother Nature gives us. But if we're going to eat more fish, we have to grow it or cultivate it, and we have to do it in the most responsible way.
Awesome. I'm going to come back to the aquaculture thing in a second and to Cliff, but Susan, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. And one of the things I liked about how Ned opened his answer there was he talked about, if I make tasty food, you'll like me. And that sort of comes to the issue, is it really just that simple? If we have tasty, healthy food, we'll eat it? Or are there more things going on that drive people towards unhealthier diets or otherwise? So maybe you could unpack for us some of the psychological factors that we've been talking about.
Sure, and that really was a good connection. I think getting back to what Brett said a little while ago, one of the wonderful things about focusing on a sustainable diet is that it's something that we each as individuals have some control over, the choices we make. But I think it's also clear that just because we know what are the right choices to make doesn't necessarily mean we do make those choices. We choose our foods for all kinds of other reasons that may make it less likely that we pick the things that are most healthy for the environment and for ourselves. So why do we do that? Well, a lot of it is habit. We learn certain eating habits, and so we need to be mindful about those habits and think about the possibility of change as opposed to just continuing to do it mindlessly. The social context is really important, and that social context can include the cultural background that says this way of eating is the right way, and another way of eating doesn't feel as right to me. Maybe it doesn't have the personal resonance, and that doesn't mean we should kind of run roughshod over that social context, but acknowledge it. Make sure, especially, that there's not a top-down sort of thing where some star chamber panel is telling everybody how to eat, but they listen to people saying, well, here are some of the things we want to be able to maintain that are important to us. But there can be some very simple factors as well. Just you don't know how to eat some of these foods, or you don't know where to find these foods, or you don't know how to prepare them. So we need to provide that kind of information, like your wonderful cookbook. And then we just need to recognize that we also make our food choices based on how other people respond to our food choices, in part. So there might be things that we each eat when nobody else is looking. You know, I know that I used to eat these sort of junk foods when my husband would go away on a business trip, so he wouldn't know that I was choosing to eat these things. And sometimes people can respond to...
I can own that feeling as well.
Sometimes people might respond to you if you're trying to make sustainable food choices as, oh, you're just being so high and mighty and moralistic, and you're trying to tell me how to lead my life. So we need to find positive ways to express healthy food choices as a friendly gesture, not a I know the right way to eat and I'm eating more morally than you kind of stance.
All right, so I'm going to open it up a little bit more and invite the whole panel to respond to that at this point. And Brent and Courtney, if you want to jump in, I might let you say another word or two. Ben, Cliff, I'm going to come back to you on aquaculture in a second. But Hannah, I mean, one of the things we've talked about is this issue of meat shaming, which really picks up on what Susan just said. And how do we avoid the sort of preachy, top-down, moralistic star chamber kind of thing, especially in light of the things like what Clifford was saying about the importance of context and place-based diets? And maybe you want to kick us along the conversation.
Sure. You know, one of the things that even in this conversation that I'm seeing happen is, we talk about the consumers over here and, our habits that we have and the context that we live in and the culture. What do we know about our food literacy? Can we cook? And then we talk on the production side over here, what's available? How accessible is it? What are the markets? What are the infrastructure? What is the labor? And these conversations often happen in really siloed ways. And I think being able to bring those conversations together, maybe we don't know about a certain food because it's not available in our context, or maybe it's not available in our context because a traditional food system has been erased by a monoculture of industrial agriculture. So I really think a lot about questioning the system we have now and looking at the systems we had before and looking at the systems that we might want to see in the future, and what can we take from the good from each of those that helps move us along towards these goals of having food that's available and accessible and healthy and culturally appropriate and socially just in the way that it's produced. So, I think these habits are not divorced from the context of production, and the social context and the food literacy isn't divorced from issues of food availability and food literacy and the kinds of nutrition that we learned about in school. This is watching my kids go through elementary school right now and looking at the food guide that they looked at last year and looking at the food guide that they looked at this year. This one looks a lot more like the way we already eat, and so that's great. But how do we actually translate that into their lives as they grow up, and are they going to have the ability to access these foods? Are they going to have a minimum wage? If you look at, we haven't even talked about sort of people's income or their ability to purchase what, according to that plate, are often much more expensive foods. So I think that issue of equity is a piece to bring into the question as well.
Tamara, you want to jump in? And
Yes.
Hannah, can you turn off the mic? Thanks.
Yes, I would like to echo the issue of equity. In talking about the good food transformation, I think that it's also important to integrate and embed the foundation of equity. So the good food, equitable, sustainable transformation. And I think to avoid the eco-colonial or top-down approach, I think it would be worthwhile discussing and talking about, who are being represented in this conversation, looking at the food movement, food scholarship, for example, in Canada. And the fact is that we can still do with a lot more diverse representation, whether it be cultural, class, income, gender. And I think that when we especially integrate people who are the most vulnerable and who often bear the burden of particular food policies, I think we will have not only encourage diverse voices, but also have alternatives in terms of the conversation and how we approach things.
So I'm going to give a shout out to my colleagues, and in a couple weeks, a colleague of mine from the University of Guelph, Simon Samoji, is releasing a report where they worked with an economist to compare the cost of the old food guide versus the cost of the new food guide. And actually the new food guide is slightly cheaper for consumers if you used supermarket prices from December of last year. So that's an interesting point, that actually some of this stuff about high cost may not be as we think it is. At any rate, does anybody else want to jump into this issue of equity? We've heard from Tamara, we've heard from Susan. I'm going to drive us back into aquaculture in a second, so this is an issue of moment to talk about equity. Ned?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily want to touch on equity specifically, but one of the things that we hear in the seafood space often is, sustainable seafood is more expensive. And so I think if we can shift, and, that may have been true 20 years ago, and now as we continue to improve access and be able to study more fisheries on science-based decisions, it opens up the globe to accessibility for sure. I call my food globally inspired and locally created. And so as we live in a city like Vancouver, we have all this incredible diversity surrounding us, and we have a massive country. We have 3 oceans. There's only 5 oceans in the world, and we're surrounded by 3 of them. So, we're a pretty lucky place to be when it comes to access to clean, healthy protein from the ocean. And so for me as a chef, I wear a white jacket and I'm a chef, but at the end of the day, I'm a cook. I'm a tradesperson. And so I would say I just want people to cook more food, more clean, healthy food. Real food heals. And so if we can get people cooking more at home instead of picking up the phone and ordering over their app for something fast and cheap and furious. We are creatures of habit. We go to the grocery store and we buy the same things, chicken and broccoli. I challenge people. I say when I go shopping, I leave a couple of lines blank at the bottom of my list, and I force myself to buy things I haven't bought before.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, because then I'm exploring with different vegetables, or I'm buying a seafood I haven't seen before. I have a challenge in my book. I call it the 52 and 12. I want you to eat 52 meals of sustainable seafood once a week for the next year, and then once a month I want you to try something from the ocean you've never had before. And so it's a commitment that I think most of us can live by, whether you live on the West Coast, the East Coast, or you don't have access to ocean fish.
All right, well, we keep talking about aquaculture, and I promised Cliff a chance here. So, I mean, one of the strategies as was Brent and Courtney told us, is to expand the global aquacultural production and derive more healthy food from that process. But I worry that that might be controversial for many indigenous communities that are still trying to fight to protect wild and indigenous aquatic species. So can you bring us back down to earth on this one, Cliff, and give us some sense of where we should go on the aquaculture question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major issue here on the West Coast, for example, is farmed Atlantic salmon. I think there are all kinds of aquaculture that are sustainable, shellfish aquaculture. There's different ways of doing it. But for me, I tend to break it down to open net pens, farmed Atlantic salmon that pose a threat to wild indigenous species. And there are, I know the Namgis in Alert Bay, Kwakwala speaking people, they were experimenting with a land-based system. I haven't looked at it recently to see how it's doing or if they're able to make a run of it business-wise. But I think one of the important things that I also want to shift this towards a little bit is the reason why. So my community of Ahousaht is involved in fish farms. The company was previously a Norwegian company named Cermaq. They were sold to Mitsubishi about 2 or 3 years ago. And I think one of the main reasons why they don't do more sustainable is it doesn't make as much money. The profit margins are a lot less. And as I was talking with other colleagues about the massive amount of investment it takes to do a land-based system, it's just there's less money in it. So what I kind of want to segue into is sort of the underlying capitalist system that this all has to work within. And also the kind of social and individual psychological aspects of that in terms of change when there's structural economic reasons to not change.
Okay, well, I have to pitch then to Susan, if that's where you're going to leave us, Cliff. Susan, we've talked about the obstacles to change, and this whole theme is being hosted by a psychology department, and it's about essentially the psychology of change. So, I mean, are we just back to the old structure agency debate, or can you give us some sense of how, within the confines of a capitalist system, we can effect change? Oh, and if you throw your mic on.
There we go. Yeah, well, I'm not going to get too much into how do we respond to capitalism as individuals. That would be a different discussion. It would take much longer. But definitely there are things...
Hannah wants to talk about that, though. So we'll go to Hannah next.
I'll leave that to my colleague. Absolutely. I think that we can... we can provide people with practical help, and I think often we focus too much on, we need to change people's minds, and sometimes it's not their minds we need to change. It's just their abilities and their skills and their access. So certainly when we're thinking about food production was one of the things that was discussed, and food distribution, in addition to food choices, we need to make sure people have access to the sustainable foods that we want them to choose. We need to provide skills for how do you cook this? How can you eat a healthy vegetarian diet, for example, or eat a healthy diet with less meat? I think a lot of parents are worried about whether their children will get enough protein, for example. So actually providing people with practical help, practical skills, and support groups to get that social context that, yes, we're going to try these new things, and maybe nobody will like it, but then we'll have fun because we're all trying this new thing together and deciding we didn't like it. So just providing each other that sort of moral support for changing our diets as well.
Hannah, I know you're dying to jump in on this one.
Well, I just want to get back to Ned's point that, changing the system isn't just about our knowledge. It's about radical redistribution of resources. And so that's whether that's capital infrastructure for land-based aquaculture or whether that's new food distribution systems that can help food get to where it needs to go more efficiently, which can reduce its cost and make it more accessible. All of that requires money to move, and it requires political will to move. And so one of the hopeful things that I have seen in our work, in our classes at UBC and at SFU and in the social movements that we've worked with, both here in British Columbia and also in Latin America, is that as youth get involved in these food movements, as they learn about healthy food, as they practice cultivating it, as they practice cooking it, they're also becoming more politically aware, and they're realizing that their actions, they don't just vote with their fork, they actually have to vote with their voices and get involved in things like food policy councils, to get involved in elections, to get involved in land redistribution systems. So I guess, that to me is kind of the next step of these goals are wonderful in this report, but to get there is actually a political challenge. It's not actually a technology challenge. It's not a knowledge challenge. It's actually a structural challenge of how do you get the system that we have to shift to where we know it needs to be with the technology and with the people that we have. So it's not a silver bullet problem. I think it's actually a political problem.
All right, so I'm actually going to ask Brent or Courtney to answer a question at this point, if you guys are okay with me putting you on the spot like this. And I'm going to pick up on one of the things Hannah just said, and that, you've given us some guidelines on where we ought to be, but no guidance on how to get there. And I want to go one step further and pick up on a comment you made in your presentation, Brent, where you essentially said, what we've presented is not all that new. We've known that we shouldn't eat too much, that we should eat mostly plants, and that we should probably cook it ourselves for a long time. And Michael Pollan basically said exactly that 10 years ago. My grandmother probably would say a version of that. So in the commission, did you talk about the how do we get there questions, the thorny political structural issues that the panelists are raising now? And maybe allow us to peer behind the screen for a moment. And you're going to have to turn your mic on, I think.
We talked about it a lot, like after hours over drinks, because these are thorny, really tricky issues, and the thing about them is there's no easy solution. And they're a bit like a black hole. Once you open it up, you like, where do you stop? And with this commission, we had to put very clear boundaries on what we could and could not discuss. What we had the capacity to do, this global commission, it took 3 years, is just define a healthy diet. How do we produce it, and what does a healthy diet look like, and that's it. If we're to get wade into this area, we'd still be working on it. We'd be working on it until 2050. So they're absolutely essential issues that have to be discussed. Nowhere do we say they're not important issues. We have to figure out how to tackle them, but stop talking about them forever and trying to figure out what are the main issues, how do we solve them, and let's get to work solving them.
I was going to say, Ned, you must have some hows. You're a practical guy.
Well, I was going to say I'm the product of a great home economics teacher, and at the end of the day, I was inspired at a young age to cook food and fell in love with it as a young teenager, and that was before Food Network existed, when it was cool and sexy to be a celebrity chef. It was more just sort of about the craft and the trade. I think, not to be trite, but education is key for the next generation. Showing them how to cook food at home with the family, sharing meals together with the community. I don't want to simplify it too much, but it does start with teaching kids how to cook and recognizing that fish and or meat doesn't come wrapped in cellophane at the grocery store. It comes from an animal, or it comes from a tree or a plant. It comes from the earth. And so, I have 3 sons, and I tell a story often about my little boy Max, who's 9 now, but when he was 4, we were flying to a family vacation, and as the plane was landing, he said to me, "Daddy, what's your favorite fish in the ocean that we're allowed to eat?" So he understood it. He completely understood it, and I don't preach to my children, but he just sort of... He was a sponge. He understood that there was fish in the ocean that we're not allowed to eat, or we shouldn't be eating as much, apex predators, bluefin tuna, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's education. It starts at home, and then it translates into the system.
So Courtney, from the perspective of a practicing doctor.
Yeah, so I'm also the product of a home ec teacher. And she made sure we had really good food skills, and I didn't realize that other people didn't get that training at home till I actually got to SFU, and I lived in a place where we had a communal kitchen, and the Shrum Scholarship winner came in, had cold water, stuck a whole box of spaghetti in there, turned it up to 12, and left. We're like, dude. So we didn't want the kitchen to blow up, so we turned it off, and and then it was a congealed mess, and he was confused, and he never tried to cook again. And so skills are important, right?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And so when we look at sort of who can start to motivate people to teach those skills, we don't learn almost anything about nutrition in med school. And that's something we can change. So I actually have a friend who's a doctor in Powell River who has been for the last couple of years at decision points in her practice. So if someone comes in, we talked about how a more plant-based diet can reduce cardiovascular disease. So if she has a patient who's at risk for that, she says, hey, I run 4 times a year group nutrition classes at the local cooking center with basically a plant-based nutritionist. Do you want to sign up for one of those? And she's actually managed to get a billing code for that. So she gathers people and she actually starts to do this in a really practical way. So doctors are actually mobilizing around planetary health. Just 2 days ago, the World Family Doctors issued a declaration calling on family doctors to take action on planetary health, and it was endorsed by our Canadian Family Practice College. So we're at the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Engagement is going like this. Like, it's actually almost like drinking from a very fast hose in terms of how much doctors, as they connect health of people to health of the planet, want to get involved. So actually, it's a bit of a movement building moment for us, and this is a really practical place where doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals can get involved and actually get it into the healthcare system itself. Use our hospitals as teaching moments for people. So yeah, I think there's actually a lot we can do.
Tamara, I'm going to pitch back over to you, and Courtney's brought us back from the level of the individual up to the climate and the planetary health. And one of the issues that I know has preoccupied you throughout your career is regarding food waste, which is a huge contributor to climate change, is also something that we as individuals can do something about, but there are lots of structural issues. So I've lost actually the question I was going to ask you, so I'm just going to say food waste. Discuss.
Food waste, discuss. Okay, that sounds good. And just as an addition to that, I'm also a product of home economics, but from the Indonesian context, which is interesting. In addition to learning how to cook food and process and manage, it's also important to learn how to grow food. And having that opportunity to value food, to connect to food, to understand the energy, labor, resources, and all of the raccoons and squirrels that come after your food is very, very important so that you don't actually waste food. And with regards to the Eat Lancet report, I mean, food waste is front and center. It contributes to the greenhouse gas methane, which is more potent than carbon dioxide. And interestingly, and it's quite scandalous actually, recently an article came out that says healthy eaters waste more food. And that was the title of the article and the study. And throughout my studies and when I conduct food waste audit, in fact, fresh fruits and vegetables are the most wasted food. So in the case of Toronto, 44%, the study that I just recently conducted, 44% of the food waste is fresh fruits and vegetables. And so how do we get, so obviously people are buying fresh fruits and vegetables, they're just not putting it in the bellies, they're putting it in the bin. So I think what's very important in this conversation is to have an integrated policy and strategy that can really look at how we as a society can reduce food waste, reconnect ourselves to food so that we value food differently. And so that includes everything from food waste awareness campaign to structural changes to looking at the food production system. So it's everything. And I encourage all of us to sit together, and I see a food waste expert, I see actually a lot of food waste experts and food system experts in the room. I think we need a chat after this panel's over so we can actually start working.
It sounds good.
Could I jump in and pick up on something that has come out of what a few people said recently, which is that food, changing our eating habits and our diet is not just like learning to recycle. Food is this very emotional arena, and that can work against us because we make our food choices on so many bases other than what we actually need from a nutritional point of view, and even a flavor point of view. We eat because of stress. We eat because of social cues. This is what everybody else is eating, or it's a way to spend time together. So it can be a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity. And this is where I think what Tamara said, what Ned said, you really see the connection people have to their food, and that can be a really a source of value in your life. And so if we encourage people to kind of respect and and honor their familial connections to food, their cultural connections to food. That can be a motivation for developing these kinds of habits of eating more mindfully, preparing food with your family, and so on.
Ed, please, yeah.
I want to quickly tell a brief story on pre-consumer food waste. So before it even gets to the consumer, it's thrown away. And that's a significant percentage of the $31 billion that we waste, food that we waste in this country. So a couple weeks ago, I was touring an alternative protein farm, otherwise known as black soldier flies. It's called Intera, and it's just out in the valley. And there was a lineup of semi-trailer trucks waiting to drop their food off, often free to this facility. Sometimes they paid to drop their food off because it had to be depackaged first. And I took some incredible photos. If you are interested and go on my Instagram, you can sort of see. So it was, perfectly ripe vegetables, perfectly...
Sorry, just let me cut in just to explain. The food was being dropped off to act as a source of food for the black soldier flies.
Correct. So, massive facility where packages of tomatoes and peppers and baked goods and bananas and, everything you could possibly imagine. Basically, it was a grocery store in a warehouse. And that food was going to be fed to the grubs, to the soldier flies. And they were going to eat it, and they were going to create this little thing that they would then turn into pet food, alternative protein for animals, for chicken feed. Obviously, I guess I saw something that I really thought was unique in that food waste was being turned into something else that potentially we would then feed to humans. But, we really need to try and figure out how to not have semi-trailers worth of food that's perfectly ripe waiting to be dropped off before it has even got to the grocery store.
Good, thanks. Hey, Hannah, I've just been handed a question for you, if I may. And since I'm the moderator, I may. Does organic production of food emit more or less greenhouse gas emissions than conventional? And you might actually want to pitch that one to the other side of the room over there, because we do have someone who knows a fair bit about that sitting over there. So, Naveen, I'm going to give you permission to jump up and contradict whatever Hannah's about to say.
Yeah, I think it depends on which crop, which ecological context, and which kind of organic. I think there's a lot of studies trying to get at this question, and I would say that there's not scientific consensus, and partially that has to do with the way in which we look at organic food production systems and what kind of inputs we use to replace the nutrients that organic food uses when it grows. So we have compost, we have animal manure, and we have synthetic organic fertilizers, all of which have different greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we should ask Sean Smuckler. There's a long-term study right now at UBC Farm actually trying to look at this, looking at different organic soil amendments and looking specifically at their greenhouse gas emissions. But Naveen maybe has a different answer. So.
Yeah, Naveen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've studied this very issue. So why don't you take a stab at that one?
Is that working? Yeah.
Yeah.
We did a study where we tried to synthesize what is known in the literature about greenhouse gas emissions, and we found that first, as Hannah said, there are not that many comparative studies of organic and conventional, but on average, organic does better than conventional per unit area. So if you have the same 1 hectare of organic farm next to a 1 hectare of conventional farms. But on average, organic also has lower yields, so there seems to be a trade-off between yields and greenhouse gas emissions. So the very few studies that have actually looked at comparing organic and conventional per unit product, which means same kilogram of food produced, organic seems to do slightly worse, but we need more studies that look at both the yields and the greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, thanks. And that actually gives us a nice segue to the second part, where we're more or less at time where we can open the floor up to questions. I've got tons of questions, and we'll just keep peppering our guests with questions, but I'm happy to take questions from the audience as well at this point. So if you've got a question, just Wendy and I will try to keep our eyes open, raise a hand, and I'll point to you. But I will keep asking questions for as long as they let me. So any questions at the moment? Right there. You're the first one I saw with your hand up. So push the button, turn the light on, ask your question, and then push the button again to turn the light off.
All right, cool. So a lot of the panelists mentioned that youth are sort of at the forefront in a lot of ways of this movement, or they're taking on that mantle. And my background's largely in socioecology, and we talk about behavior change there. And the article that my professor brought up when I was at UBC was the Nudge, Nudge, Think, Think article for behavior change. And so what I want to dive in is actually the psychological change that has to happen between generations, because I feel like a lot of young people are being brought up in this age where we know we have to give certain things up. We also have different food guides. We were raised with different food guides. And so I was hoping that you could speak more on the psychology of change that has to happen in older generations that might be more resistant. For instance, I've been vegan for 9 years. My parents are nowhere near that, despite nudging and thinking type of behavior change strategies.
So to whom are you directing that question, or are you just asking for a free-for-all? All right, that's cool. So who wants to take the first stab at answering that? Sue, Susan, I'm hoping you're... Okay.
Yeah, no, I feel that I should. I think that the difficulty there is that you're wanting the younger generation to serve as role models for the older generation, which the older generation is not very good at allowing to happen. So, but I think that it's persevere, and it might work if they see, but also maybe allow them to express some of their identity and background in a way, so they don't feel, as the older generation sometimes does, that their old ways are being thrown out and they're being asked to embrace something completely different. Maybe you could talk about how things were when they were growing up, and they spent more time probably eating less processed food, making more things from scratch. So you could maybe find ways to tie in the newer trends into some things that were more familiar to them, as opposed to them feeling like, okay, you're just telling me my entire way of life is wrong.
Tamara, I think you want to jump in.
Yes. In line with Susan, I just wanted to mention I've been part of the project by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and it's the trilateral organization working with Canada, U.S., and Mexico to tackle climate change together. And shortly coming in March, we're going to launch this youth action kit. And one of the activity in there that I think you might be interested in, and is very connected to what Susan mentioned, is preserving food, preserving stories. I remember, for example, my father telling me, because my grandparents and my father went through the war, he remembered that, his mom used to take one egg and would, like beat it like for an omelet, and then cut it for his 6 siblings. That's how he had to eat, and his experience. And so I think when you come to the elders and then ask them questions, and then also say, there's actually a lot of expertise. You probably know how to preserve food. You probably know how to cook things differently. And then if you come through that angle, there's that kind of intergenerational learning that might open up more opportunities for collaboration. So I would check out the Commission for Environmental Cooperation website coming up soon.
Hey, Cliff, can I ask you to jump in on this one? And in particular, some of the things that Tamara and the guest were talking about were intergenerational issues and connecting back to a previous time, and that's sort of picking up on what Tamara just said. But in Indigenous communities, there's been a huge break in those chains of transmission. So maybe you can reflect on how Indigenous diets have changed perhaps since contact, and what that might mean in light of our conversation tonight.
Yeah, one of the things I often like to tell is a story my dad told me when he was young. He grew up in the Moctezis village on Flores Island. The community now known as the Hausa, and he remembers, he might have been about 10 years old or so this would have been in the 50s. He remembers the first time that an Indian agent came to the village and brought cases of Spam.
Oh dear.
Or it might have been like click or prem, but you know what I mean, like that canned processed meat. And he said the first reaction was laughter. They thought it was kind of funny. And upon reflection, he realized that they did that because they thought we were poor. And that was why they laughed, because, they might have looked materially poor, or the houses seemed to look shabby compared to theirs. You know, they obviously looked at us and said, you people are obviously impoverished and you need help. So here is some spam. And they also laughed because, you know, they looked around and in terms of, you know, salmon, halibut, crabs, shellfish, seaweed, berries, nobody was hungry. So the irony in terms of intergenerational change is that now we actually are poor, or there's a large percent of our people are poor. And we've also, there's been this big migration within about 2 generations to the extent that now about 67% of New Channel people live in cities, for example, as opposed to in their home communities. We also were largely a fishing people throughout the 20th century, previous to that a whaling people. But in the 20th century, we went from like participation in the commercial fishery from about 200 New Channel-owned fishing vessels, was the statistic I heard, so in the like say in the 70s, to the point where in 2002, when we had to launch a court case to reestablish our fishing rights, we had 6 fishermen left. So we went to a point where we've all moved to the cities, and where my dad's generation, everybody was connected to fishing in some way, either commercially or just food fish, to a point where almost nobody had that connection anymore. And obviously, some of you may have seen statistics about health impacts, diabetes, heart disease, a lot of these things that are now have adapted to, I would say, a more unhealthy Western diet. Not saying that all Western diets are unhealthy, but you know, like sugars and carbs and all kinds of things that are not traditional for Indigenous peoples. So it's big. I don't have any solutions about that, but I do know that there are people that are still trying to, like I said, we have these court cases, so there's people that are trying to legally reestablish connections. My wife is Anishinaabe from Ontario, and her family harvests wild rice still, and so they're constantly battling with cottagers. If you're from Toronto, you know cottaging is a thing. And also maple syrup. My wife's mom and sisters make maple syrup every March, and so we still get a chance to access that in the cities. And I think that those are still very important connections, as my other panelists have mentioned, being intimately connected to our food. I know that's not possible for everybody, especially in the city, but I think for Indigenous peoples, it's still a big, important part of their cultures and diets.
Super, thanks. Wendy, you had somebody up there that wants to ask a question?
2 points. The first is more of a comment. Second is a question. Live in a urban area that's watershed, so we're very fortunate that way. And first time I'd noticed bottles being sold for water bottles, I was just bemused, and now it's, I believe, a problem worldwide. The second is, in 2119, if we really miss the mark and the tipping points become a real problem, what are emergency measures could be prepped in that book?
Emergency measures for the nightmare scenario. So, Tamara, it looks like you're eager to push the button on that one.
Well, just to kind of mention, over 80% of Canadians live in urban areas, and the fact is that large urban areas are more reliant on long-distance food supply chain, and therefore we are more vulnerable, so less resilient. And what's really interesting, so the renowned author and architect Carolyn Steele, author of Hungry City, mentioned that without farmers and farming, cities would not exist. And the fact of the matter is that the average age for Canadian farmers is about 55. 92% of Canadian farmers don't have any succession plan. So I think we're in deep trouble, with the exception, I would say, that University of Guelph and UBC. I think you are doing a lot of great things to try to kind of turn this. I don't think we have enough of a resiliency plan. I don't think we have enough in terms of an emergency plan. And I think this is something that we need to talk about. I see a lot of great folks here, farm folk, city folk. They're a great organization that's done a lot of work to support farmers, and there's now a matchmaking organization called FarmLink, where they match a lot of new migrant and refugees who actually have expertise in farming to connect to land. I think that there needs to be more conversation, but also like combining all the different food strategies that we have in big cities and actually making a resiliency plan to ensure that during emergency, during shutdown or what have you, we can actually feed our city.
Excellent. Ned, do you want to jump in, and then I'll go to the panelists, and then I'll come back up to another question.
Yeah, just really briefly, I mean, I come from 6 generations of fishermen from Buren, Newfoundland. You know, cod fishery collapsed in early 90s and still commercially, you know, not a fishery that is viable. And so I wonder how long we're going to still commercially fish.
Yeah.
You know, you talk about food fishery, of course, access to it for our First Nations brothers and sisters, you know, absolutely. But, you know, should we still be commercially fishing?
Brent and Brent, you want to jump in here?
Very briefly.
I'm not done yet.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Brent. I had other things. No, it's okay.
Tipping points, very briefly, I think we're very close to a lot of tipping points out there, actually, and I think we're nearing the point where we need to start panicking. There was an article in, I believe it was New York Times last week, where it was time to panic, and if there is any time that we need to mobilize action, it's now, because I think whether you're talking about biodiversity loss in oceans or on land, whether you're talking about climate change, we're very close to many points where we don't know what the long-term implications will be of these things. So, yeah, you know, being scared can not necessarily lead to action sometimes, but sometimes it can. So, yeah.
Courtney, did you want to jump in?
So Brent and I actually had a long discussion about the panic word or not. So as an emerge doc, my one job is to not panic. That is like what I get paid to do, is to not panic. And what I like, the way I like to think about it is that the code blue alarm is sounding. So the code blue alarm is sounding. When that happens in the hospital, you don't run. You walk really quickly to the bedside where there's a problem, and then you push hard, you push fast, and you don't stop until you have the healthiest outcome possible. That's where we're at. And that's why a plan like what we've got in the Eat Lancet Commission, in the food guide, is so helpful, because it gives us a North Star to point towards. Just in terms of the transitions we need to make, so part of what CAPE does is we interact with the fossil fuel industry in terms of, you know, the oil sands and fracking, and I had the opportunity to attend the climate change negotiations for the last couple of times at COP, and there's a lot of discussion around just transition in those spaces. So essentially, how do we support the fossil fuel workers of today to transition into the low carbon economy? And I think it would be helpful to import that conversation into the food space, because there are a lot of farmers who are going to have to change what they farm. I am, I think, about a 6th generation person from a farm. I own part of my family farm in Manitoba now, which has meant I've had a lot of conversations with the farmers. And their input costs are so high for these giant combines that, you know, if we want them to now grow more vegetables as opposed to less cereals, or not increase that, we're going to have to help them out, because they don't actually make very much money at all. And a lot of their input costs are fixed. So I think that, you know, in terms of a productive discussion, in order to, you know, achieve food security heading forwards and not end up in a food emergency, we really need to think about our farmers.
Wendy, I want to jump back up to you. You've got a question back there?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Is it on? So I'm an environmentalist and a hydrogeologist, and I'm definitely very concerned with climate change, but I'm also very concerned with water. Earlier you were suggesting 150% increase in nuts and some other stuff. Wheat and a lot of the other grasses that we feed to cattle are very low water intensive and often just use the natural rainwater, whereas a lot of these vegetables, tomatoes, almonds, yada yada, consume a lot of water, and we're mining that water. It's not being replaced as fast as we're using it already with a food system that is largely reliant on cereal grains. And so I guess I would pose the question of, is this on your radar, and are you really, you know, is this something that you're already really considering, or is this kind of, I didn't hear this being discussed, so I just thought I would pose the question. Yeah.
Super, thanks. So I'm going to let Brent, you want to take that one?
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, the water consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts is so much below animal source proteins. There really is no, you can't compare the two. So we absolutely have enough water on this planet to produce legumes and nuts and everything else. What we don't want to do is produce nuts in water-scarce regions such as California. That gives us the impression that it is a water-intensive food. But there are places where water isn't an issue, so it's not just about the food itself, is we really need to figure out where it's optimal to actually, grow these things.
All right, I'm seeing hands flicker up, and I've got 1, 2, and then 3, and then I will try to come back to other people. But I've got 3 identified right now, so we'll start with you, please.
Thanks. I'd like to direct this question at Hannah. It sounds like from some of the things, maximizing yields and creating efficiencies in the system, it's really about doing less harm in our current system to meet our own needs. And I'm curious to know how far away we are from making environmentally positive contributions with our global food system, and is that even possible with the population numbers that we're projected for?
That's a really good question, and I think it really speaks to the trade-offs that our food system puts before us. If it's biodiversity, if it's food security, if it's water security, if it's social justice, labor. And there's a lot of diverse views on this question, but there's a lot of people that would argue that there is a regenerative agriculture that can, there's a global social movement called the Via Campesina, or the Peasant Way, and they have a slogan saying, peasant agriculture can feed the world and cool the planet. So they argue that a diverse, multifunctional system oriented to local markets, controlled by local people, and for the benefit of people and planet, not necessarily for the benefit of profit, can actually cool the planet. So they look at agroforestry systems, they look at perennial agriculture, they look at you can even use technologies like climate-smart agriculture, and you can actually sequester carbon through the production system. You can take care of your food waste more appropriately so it's not contributing to the system. You can reduce transportation costs in agriculture. So it is possible. It's going to take a lot of change in precisely the kinds of things that Courtney was just talking about. If you're locked into a system that requires you to keep producing in a certain way because that's the equipment that you have, or that's the supply chain that you have, or that's what your consumers are asking for in terms of their dietary preferences, you actually have to push the lever along all those positions in the supply chain. But it is possible, theoretically.
Ned, do you want to jump in?
Is that like an example of that would be a forest garden?
Yeah, so a lot of the examples that are sort of discussed in the literature would be traditional, say, Latin American food systems, which are highly diversified in terms of their landscape structure. They would have a small amount of animal agriculture. They would have fruits and vegetables and some grains in a mixed cropping system in a very diverse rotation. So yeah, they might have a tilapia pond. They might have, these kind of multi-trophic systems where they're using multiple different kinds of spaces and across the different seasons to produce lots of food in a very small amount of space.
There was a question right here, yeah.
Okay, thanks. A comment and a question. I'm just thinking about the conventional versus organic. I think it's important to look beyond just CO2 and think about water pollution, biodiversity, and soil degradation. Those are other things that are part of the planetary boundaries. And and I think sometimes we get stopped in our tracks by comments that are made just specific to CO2, so we have to think past that. And second, a really practical question for Brent. Some of us are being asked to include the Eat Lancet information in our presentations already, and there's no slides on the website that I can find. Some of the Canadian consumption data, your Eat Lancet dietary slide, is there a way we can access those? Can you share your slides with us?
First off, we absolutely have to move behind. We can't just talk about greenhouse gas emissions, because if we lose on biodiversity, it doesn't matter. And if we lose on water, it doesn't matter. We have to think of all of these things together. So absolutely, climate change is important, but so is water, and so is land, and so is everything else. Slides, I will look into it, and I will get back to you, and I don't think it'll be a problem. So I'll try and get them up on our website so people can, have access to them. All right.
Harriet, I think you were the next person I had caught eyes with.
Thanks. Thanks to all the panelists. I'm particularly encouraged by some of the cultural shifts that are happening inside the policy world, and I think that's where they have to happen. So to hear, I wondered where the Canada Food Guide came from, but to be able to restrict access of lobbyists when we're doing it, that's huge. That is huge. And it means it can happen lots of places. One of the things in the policy world, one of the things that I think is really interesting right now, and I would love the panelists to either comment on this or to give other examples, is the idea of a circular economy. It's been adopted by the European Union. To my amazement, it's been adopted by the City of Toronto. But it's caught in these institutional divisions that we have, so it's focused mainly on waste and a little step at a time, so it's plastic straws and now, which is all really, really good. It's just that we need to somehow integrate our institutional systems so that they can get away from some of these trade-offs and can actually take up what a circular world would look like. And farming, of course, was the original circular economy before it started getting so specialized and geographically dispersed and moved around. So that's the main thing. There at the consumer end, I remember when I was I think it was in 2012 in France, the government introduced changes rules about what the supermarkets could do in terms of packing things and offering smaller, offering better unit price for buying larger amounts, which is one of the ways that people waste. So it's, there's so many small ways that are built in to either the rules we already have or to the powers like the supermarkets. They're making their own rules, and they're doing it for profit, but they can also be regulated in ways like that, so that if we can penetrate the different practices and start to shift them towards something like a circular economy, it seems like we can make a lot of progress. Just the one more thing I want to say is I've heard it come up a lot here, that talking about ecological sustainability and environment isn't only about making sacrifices. In the long run, it's about living well. It's about regeneration. It's about sufficiency. It's about things that make our lives actually better. And I think we need to incorporate that somehow into our way of talking.
Just wanted to give the panel an opportunity to respond very quickly. Tamara, you nodding your head?
I want to respond, but I think you should also mention the initiative that you're doing at the city of Guelph with the circular economy closing.
Oh, you're being very generous?
No, I think it's very important and quite inspiring, so I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, that's nice of you, Tamara. After you. No, after you. After you. So thanks for that comment, Harriet. And Tamara's right. At the city of Guelph, we've launched a very ambitious circular economies project that is part of an Industry Canada initiative called the Smart Cities Initiative. And I think it was today we just submitted our proposal. So that's quite exciting. But there was a very interesting tension, because in negotiating the components of the proposal, there was the economic development people, the sustainability people, and the social justice people. And we worked really hard. And I say we, credit to the folks at City Hall that led the charge, worked really hard to bring those three very distinct components a year ago together into a common vision around creating 50 new circular economy related businesses, reducing waste by 50%, and reducing food insecurity in the region by 50%. And it wasn't easy to get to the point where we all got singing off the same choir sheet, but the document I was reading on the weekend was looking very impressive. So thank you for the shout out, Tamara. And now back to you.
Okay, great. So just to answer a little bit your question, Harriet. So what we have is this phenomenon called distancing, which is the separation of primary resources extraction from consumption, so final consumption decision. And when we're thinking about our food system, and especially our urbanized world, we have very long distance food supply chain. We don't know who our farmer is. We're not sure what the labor condition is. And it's very hard to design or to shape a closed loop food system or a circular city when you have a lot of barriers and a lot of So I think instead of having this distancing process, we need to start reconnecting, and this is why the investment that Hannah was mentioning in terms of food infrastructure, in terms of food hubs, it's very important to seriously look at that so that we can build that resiliency at the local level.
All right, we're running the clock down, and you've had your hand up very patiently, so thank you for your patience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to look at some of the psychological aspects here. The first one being that a lot of people do panic, and for good reasons. But I think what we need to focus on, and maybe you could address some of the ways of doing this, is the incredible potential we have. If we have a vision of, and it's been mentioned before, how we can transform things so everybody benefits. We can get away from some of the fear that's generated, very understandably. Second, from a point of view of social psychology, one of the things that's been established going back to the work of Stanley Milgram and Phil Zimbardo is that if you change the situations people are in, it can make all the difference in the world. What's going on in Guelph may be an example. Some of you may remember that in Vancouver, if you wanted to recycle newspapers, you had to drive down to the depot, which wasn't very efficient. It didn't get much done. Now they'll come by and pick it up. If we went forward and say made all public transportation free, the benefits are obvious ecologically, in terms of health and so on. But to do that, of course, we have to organize. We have to get active. It's not even just a question of education. We have to form, politically to insist that our governments take us seriously. And any response to that would be much appreciated.
All right, I see Ed, and then, so Ned, beg your pardon, and Cliff, did you want to jump in as well? All right, so certainly Ned.
I just want to agree with him completely. I remember the beginning of my culinary career, we used to cook the heck out of unsustainable seafood. We didn't know better, and when we found the better way, when our program OceanWise was built, it was to, give that knowledge to my peer group. And once they learned that knowledge, they were then able to shift their behavior.
I'm going to Wendy. Where's Wendy? Oh, you said you had a question over there? Okay, why don't we go to you then? And then, sorry, Brenda, are you wanting? So 1 second, sir. Sorry, Brenda, I'm going to let you jump in.
I just wanted to shout out and say that chefs play an extremely important role here, because I think chefs are the leaders in cities and other areas in terms of being able to lead the way and mobilize people. And if you can show us how to cook this food in healthy, sustainable ways, people, and tasty, and really tasty, people will follow. So I would say we need you guys.
Courtney, and then I'm going to go back to the back.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And as I've been trying to organize the doctors, what I've realized is that doctors don't know how to organize. But there are humans who do. And so part of the multidisciplinarity of all of this is to acknowledge that that's a whole skill set, and that people who are called campaigners exist, and that they have tools that the rest of us don't know how to use. So for instance, right now, the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, they have this incredible network of 135 member countries worldwide, and we're trying to hire them a campaigner to help them get climate change and health into curricula, because we have the curricula. It's everywhere, but they need help organizing. And so, call a campaigner is, I think, maybe part of what we're learning.
All right, patient man at the back. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything you shared tonight. I really appreciate just hearing all the different perspectives and all the different both potential, solutions or opportunities as well as those challenges. I really think we do need a structural change. For sure. And I was just surprised, just thinking of talking about health and doctors, is that no one mentioned dietitians, who actually are well positioned to be those people, those intermediates between sort of the research and people. I'm a dietitian, I work with people, and I try to encourage folks to eat healthier every day, and I find that is a very difficult conversation when you frame it in terms of any sort of guilt or moralizing. So that definitely came up today as well, and just finding it doesn't make a difference. It then tends to actually reinforce old habits. But I guess what I wanted to ask is a little bit more specifically a nutrition question, pardon if that's okay, around the old food guide. Actually, if people followed it, would have reduced have made a big difference in our overall consumption patterns. And the problem was people didn't follow it. So the new food guide doesn't actually say anything super new. Is just the way they formatted it has been a bigger push. I'm hoping that it helps change patterns, but are you more hopeful Because the previous one had all those same messages of choosing more plant-based proteins, having whole grains, lots of fruits and vegetables, and it didn't change consumption patterns at all. So just curious.
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, we can produce these things, and if they sit on a shelf like this report, if nobody actually does something, puts it into action, nothing will happen, and that's where government has to step up. But it's not just the political leaders; it's also businesses. Businesses have the tool right there in front of them. Although the food guide right now is very qualitative, the quantitative numbers I think are coming this fall. But it's right there. Businesses can step up. We can all step up. We don't have to wait for the political leaders to actually do this. Schools, academic, canteens. There's a role for each one of us to play.
Okay, I'm going to go Ned and Susan, and then one last question. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the panelists, including Courtney and Brent, to just sort of give one final message to the audience. So Ned and Susan, up to the front, and then a roundup at the back.
Super quickly, just wanted to give a shout out to the dietitian for standing up and bringing that to attention, because of course, as a chef, we aren't taught in culinary school the importance of the quality of food and how it's valuable to our health. My grandfather was a physician, and when I told him I wanted to be a chef, he looked at me like I had a hole in my head. He couldn't quite process, to him the chef was the guy carving roast beef at the country club. It wasn't somebody that really, if he was still alive, I would be able to have pretty awesome conversations around human health, whether it was medicine or, diet. And so dietitians are extraordinarily important to me as a chef so that I can understand what I'm cooking and what I'm feeding to people is properly curated. And the healthcare system, for sure. I mean, doctors and dietitians and chefs should be having cooking classes together for people. Honestly, I think we have an idea there. Yeah.
Susan.
Yeah, I think that was a great point about how we already know what we should be eating and are not doing it. And I'm trying to be an optimist. I generally try to be an optimist. And I think if we think about the individual relationship with their food, many people across society are dissatisfied with their own relationship with food, independent of climate issues. They know they're not eating healthily in one way or another. So why would it be any different this time? Well, I think this panel shows that there are so many reasons for changing our dietary habits that are maybe not the ones we're used to thinking about. And if we think about not just this sort of moralistic approach that I should be eating better or I've been bad, and people really do moralize their relationship with food, but in a more informed way that we recognize that changing eating habits is necessary to benefit the environment as well as to allow other people to also survive with a sustainable diet. We might be able to approach it in a more rational way and not sort of get bogged down in this swamp of moral self-doubt and just strategize and be practical about, okay, we need to do this. What are some ways that we can go about changing?
Super, thanks, Susan. Last question from the audience is yours, and then we'll do a roundup.
Hi. I just have a question about the offer that we have for example, in Vancouver, because people know what they're supposed to eat, but just walking downtown, you see all these big industries that promote really, really bad food for us. And how do you expect people to kind of cope with that? Because we know that we want fatty, sugary, and salty things, and that's what they offer us.
It's a very good point. Anyone want to respond? I mean, I think we all probably agree with your articulation there. We do have an evolutionary soft spot for fat, sugar, and salt. Love it.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I think businesses, yeah, they are a huge part of the problem, and they're putting stuff, whether it's marketing or whatever, in front of us that tastes really good, but it's really bad for us. But they're also part of the solution. And I work a lot with businesses, and for the most part, they're heading in the right direction. And the thing about business is they can do it really quick. You know, we're working with Burger King up in the Nordic region, and they can offer a plant-based burger within months. Politicians take years, you know. So yes, they are part of the problem, and we have to change it. But you'll see that it can shift very quickly when they want to. So.
Okay, at this point, we have basically run the clock down. Tamara, last thoughts for the audience from you.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, everyone. So again, as a food system planner and from a food system planning perspective, I work a lot with community. I do a lot of community engagement, and I also think about how cities, as you said, you mentioned, you walk through downtown, what do you see, what nudges you, how does the built environment shapes how you shop. I think that it's important for planners to work with psychologists to get the right messaging, because we are on the ground, we're working with the community, we're also helping make decisions on what should go where, and working with psychology I think is a really important opportunity, and I really thank you and thank the Department of Psychology for opening this opportunity up.
Super, thanks Tamara. Ned, any last thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Gosh, so many. Again, a huge thank you to
just one, though. Just
okay,
one.
Yeah, SFU for huge thank you to SFU and my panelists for you know sitting shoulder to shoulder today and really diving into this conversation, or digging in depending on what we're talking about. You know, remember, in our own communities we can support farmers markets, we can support community supported fisheries. We can support, you know, plant-based cafes that are offering great choices. We can vote with our wallets, and so hopefully we will continue to support the outliers that are trying to push the envelope instead of making the simple decision and going to the, you know, sweet, salty choices. You know, dig in a little bit deeper. Certainly when it comes to your own wellness and your own health, people are watching you, and you know, when they're inspired by what they see around them in their own communities, hopefully they'll be making some different decisions.
Thank you. Susan, we're actually going to skip you because you got the last word, right? So we're going to jump over you with apologies. And Cliff, do you want to leave the audience with something to think about?
Yeah, thank you. There's always something that comes to mind when I think about these sorts of things. It's a new channel phrase or teaching, if you will, and it's Hishukish Tsawak, which means everything is one. It's very vague and very general, but I think it's an important thing to think about when thinking about food or the climate. Everything is connected. We're all interconnected, and decisions we make, they ripple, and it's been useful for me in terms of making decisions. Thank you.
Hannah.
2 points to make. One, I was reflecting on the kind of the psychology sort of input here about think, nudge, nudge, and you know, I wanted to take that to its next logical conclusion, which was vote, and regulate. And that kind of responds to this question about what we're being served downtown, and many cities are being very successful with carbon taxes and sugar taxes. So these are very, very clear policy levers that we can use when people actually become aware of the food system that surrounds us, and that there are really important policy levers that we can use to change that. And then just, you know, thinking about what I've heard as I've moved to this territory. I had the privilege to be in a meeting with the Secwepemc Elder Wolverine in the Interior Salish, and he's been very active before he passed away in protecting the land and actually looking after the land, the water, the air, and the salmon. And he always said food is what brings people together, and that's really stuck with me. As you know, we're all here because we care about food and we care about the planet that we live on, and we're coming from all these different places. And it is all one. It's all the same problem, and we have lots and lots of opportunities to address this problem coming from lots of different places. So I think there is a lot of hope out there.
Thanks, Hannah. Courtney.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of my comments is sort of along those lines. So we had, the Lancet Countdown 2018 report had a case study on eco-anxiety and something about carbon pricing. And I thought the thing people would pick up on was the carbon pricing, because it's been in the news, and actually about 3/4 of the media was around eco-anxiety. And since then, I have had so much energy coming my way from across Canada and even the world with people telling me about how worried they are. And I think that, you know, we're all in this situation. There's the overall situation that we can do a lot to change, and we may feel anxious about that, but we don't have to feel lonely in that anxiety or in that grief. And I think one of the great things about food is that it can easily be used to bring people into community. And when we look at creating solutions, we know some of them are individual, but many of these are collective action solutions. So I think that food and conversations around food can be the entree point to creating those communities that will support us emotionally, because we will need that, as well as help us create the structures that we need to implement these policies that, you know, for instance, in food have been laid out for us.
No excuses. I mean, we now have clear targets for the first time. We have scientific global consensus on what defines a healthy, sustainable diet. This is like Paris 2015, where the world came together and said, we now have targets, let's sign, let's get to work. So you know what? We have targets for what defines healthy diets, sustainable diets. There's no excuses anymore. You know, let's get to work. We don't have a lot of time, so go home and start tonight.
So I asked you at the beginning of the evening to imagine 2100 or 2119, 100 years from now, imagining reading the history book of this. And without a doubt, the challenge we face globally is one of the grand challenges that will define this generation. There's no question at all in my mind, in any of our minds, as to that. It's on the scale as civil rights, abolishment of slavery. It's on the same scale as emancipation. And I think if we looked at the beginnings of those movements, they started with people coming into community centers and discussing the tough, challenging issues. So maybe on that history book in the future, there will be a footnote about a conversation that happened in downtown Vancouver in March of 2019. And maybe an idea from tonight or some meeting like this will lead to an innovation, to a conversation, and that will lead to change. Because I don't think anything else ever does lead to change, at least change in the direction that we all want to be heading. So with that, I'm going to pass, I think, now to Susan for a call to action, and then back to Wendy for final.
Great. Well, I think we hear pretty loud and clear the call for change, and of course that's why everybody's here. And I just want to draw out a lot of themes of what has already been said this evening and say that we have to start by changing ourselves. Because if you don't change yourself, you can't really understand what is... You can't understand what's needed to change other people. And also, you're not going to be a respected voice. You need to model the change, you know, be the change you want to see in the world, as they say. So practical tips for changing yourself. Get informed, understand what kind of change is needed, set specific goals. You know, we're well on the road towards those strategies, and tell other people, I'm going to change my behavior, and here's why. And that makes you accountable, so that's going to be more likely to encourage you to stick with that change you want to make. But also think about ways in which you can help yourself make change by making the healthy choices easy and making the difficult choices hard. You know, make the good choices at the grocery store, and then when you want to make the bad choices at home, it will be too difficult. You know, I often eat healthy because I'm too lazy to get the unhealthy food at that point. But of course, don't just change yourself. You also want to change others. And the question from over here talked about nudging, structuring choices for other people, not making the choices for them, but structuring those choices in ways that make the healthy choices more likely. Inform the other people and persuade the other people. Tie your arguments to the things they care about, but be sure to allow two-way communication so that you understand what are the things they care about and allow them to come to their own conclusions about how they can make their changes in ways that respect the things they value. And then, of course, scale up further and further. Don't just stick with changing others. We need to change society. And so I really want to echo what Hannah said, which is to vote, to communicate with other people, communicate with your political representatives, and collaborate. If we come together, that's how change really gets made at the societal level. Collective action, which can be political action, but it can also be community level action in all kinds of ways, whatever works best for you and your interests. And that work is not only likely to be more effective, but it's also likely to bring you some fringe benefits in the form of satisfaction with coming together with other people to create change. I'm done.
All right. Wow. What a couple hours, eh? Well, I just have to end here with just a couple of thank yous. First of all, again, I really want to thank Ellen, who's hiding back there, who was absolutely instrumental in putting this together. Thank you so much, Ellen. We see you back there in the red shirt. All right, I want to thank our volunteers as well that stepped up and really helped. And oh my goodness, I really want to thank our speakers and our panelists and our moderator. What an incredible group of people to volunteer their time to come and talk to us today. And thank you to all of you to come downtown for 2 hours and engage in this dialogue. Please join us now for some lovely sustainable refreshments in the lobby. And thank you.